Magona Marima, welcome to this edition of the Magona Marima Academy of Crop Production. This is the 7th in the series for 2015, and we're going to talk about fertilizing maize for optimum yields. Now, when we think about how to fertilize a crop, whether it's maize, soybeans, or groundnuts, we need to know what the fertility in the soil is like. There's a saying which says, productive soils are always fertile, but fertile soils are not always productive. I'm sure you can interpret that statement. Basically, it means that any soil that is fertile can be productive if all things work together for the good of that crop. But a fertile soil can also be unproductive because of things like drought or weeds or pests or diseases. So at the very root of it, if we want to be productive, we need to have fertile soils. Now, soil fertility is that whole concept of the soil being able to supply the nutrients that the plant requires at the time it requires. But it also includes things like the soil's ability to hold water and provide that water to the crop, the soil's ability to resist soil erosion, and the soil's ability to provide a microenvironment that is suitable for the root growth and for the growth of other microorganisms in the soil. So we want to first evaluate the fertility of our soil. And one way to do that is to do a soil test. Now, when we come to think about a soil test, there are a number of things you need to consider. Firstly, the time of year at which you will take the soil sample. Usually, we would want to take the soil sample in the winter months, when the soil is dry. So we're talking about June, July, maybe even as late as August or September. But we don't want to leave it too late because it takes a while to get the analysis done and the interpretation of those results applied. So the earlier you can do your soil analysis or your soil sample, the better it is. Now, we're quite late at this time of year. We're at the end of October now. And if you haven't taken a soil sample, well, you could still do it, and maybe you'll get the results back in time. But this is just an encouragement to plan to do your soil sampling well before the season begins. The other consideration is that you need certain tools to do a soil sample. And these tools include a spade, a plastic bucket, a paper bag, and a pen to write on the paper bag the name of the field and the time of year that you took the sample. So get the tools that you need. You can use a spade or a buzzer, but a spade is very nice because you can take that soil sample and put it into the plastic bucket and then use that composite sample to submit to the soil laboratory. Now, when you go to your field to take your soil sample, what do? Well, you need to look at your field and divide it up into areas of uniformity. So you might have a field that is sloping down to a river, for example, and the soil changes as you go from the upland down towards the river. Usually the soil will become darker and heavier as you go down towards the river. Or you might find that there's an anthill in certain places, and so on. So you want to sample your field in areas that are uniform. So in a field you might have one sample that you submit, or you might have 3 or 4 samples that you submit. In each of those uniform areas, you would want to take about 15 to 20 sub-samples. So you would walk randomly across that area, maybe it's an area of 5 or 10 hectares, and take a sub-sample every 100 meters or so, every 200 meters, in random positions, and put those into the plastic bucket. And when you get to the end of that exercise, you would mix up that soil, take out a kilogram, put it into the paper bag, label that paper bag, and submit it to the laboratory. When you submit a sample to the laboratory, they will do their analyses of the nutrients that are in that soil. And then they will give you the results, usually with an interpretation and a recommendation. That recommendation is what you would then use to fertilize your maize crop. You might also ask for some expert advice from an agronomist, and you would be welcome to talk to us about how to interpret and apply the results that you get from your soil sample. And one of the first things that you would look at when you get your soil sample back is your soil pH. pH is a measure of the acidity or alkalinity of the soil. When the pH is measured on a water basis, a pH of 7 is neutral. If a pH is higher than 7, it is alkaline, and if it's less than 7, it is acidic. Now in Zimbabwe, we measure our soil pH with what's called a calcium chloride solution. And that brings out a more realistic measure of the soil pH in terms of crop production. And when you measure your pH with calcium chloride, the neutral level is about 6. So if your soil is at a pH 6 under the calcium chloride pH test, your soil is neutral. Anything less than that is acidic, anything more than that is alkaline. Now some laboratories might test with a potassium chloride solution. And a potassium chloride solution gives you a pH value somewhat in between water and calcium chloride. But we'll confine ourselves to the Zimbabwe system. For maize, you want a pH of at least 5.2 or more. You don't want it greater than 6.5, so the range of an ideal pH is between 5.2 and about 6.5 for maize. If the pH is less than 5.2, you would need to apply lime to your soil. Now the quantity of lime that you would apply depends basically on two things. It depends firstly on the pH of the soil, and secondly on the clay content of the soil. So the lower the pH, the more lime is required, and the sandier the soil, the less lime is required. So let me give you an example. Let's say we go and test our soil, and we get a pH of 4.4. That's acidic. In fact, it's very acidic. And your maize will not grow well at a pH of 4.4. You would then want to apply lime. The amount of lime that you would apply on a sandy soil would be about 1,000 kilograms per hectare. On a clay soil, on the other hand, you would want to put on about 2,000 or 2,500 kilograms of lime to get your pH up to that 5.2, 5.5 level. Now lime takes a long time to work in a soil. It's not an instantaneous thing like putting nitrogen onto a soil. It takes 6 months to even 12 months to react with the soil and to change the pH. That's why we want you to test your soil early, June, July, so that you can put that lime on and it can begin to work so that by the time you plant your maize, there's been some reaction in the soil. But really, it'll only be towards the end of the season, the rainy season, when the lime will have fully worked. The kind of lime that you're going to choose depends on the other nutrients that the soil test result gives you. So, in certain areas you would want to use calcitic lime. Calcitic lime only contains calcium as a nutrient, whereas you get another kind of lime called Dolomitic lime. Dolomitic lime contains both calcium and magnesium. Dolomitic lime is obtained from Alaska or Baichinoy area, whereas calcitic lime comes from the concession area. So generally speaking, if you are farming on this side, the eastern side of the Great Dyke, you would want to use Dolomitic Lime. And if you're farming on the western side of the Great Dyke, you would use Calcitic Lime. Because on the western side of the dike, there tends to be more calcium in the soil, excuse me, than on the eastern side of the dike. But again, that's a very broad generalization, and the soil test result would give you a much better indication of what kind of lime you would apply. Now, how will you apply this lime? Well, because lime takes a long time to work in the soil, ideally you would want to mix that lime with the soil with some kind of tillage operation. But as we've been promoting in this series, we would recommend or propose that farmers move towards conservation agriculture. And one of the principles of conservation agriculture is that you do minimum soil disturbance with tillage operations. So, if you are going to move towards conservation agriculture, you want to improve or ameliorate your soil with lime before you begin conservation agriculture, so that you get your pH up to that 5.5 level before you begin conservation agriculture. If you are already doing conservation agriculture, then you can apply the lime on the surface without incorporation. With time, that lime will slowly work its way into the soil, but it will take time. It can take up to 2 years, but the surface of the soil will change the pH. So in conservation agriculture, you can apply the lime on the surface, and it will slowly work its way into the soil, beginning at the soil surface and slowly moving down. In some situations, farmers have applied lime into the planting hole with a cup in each planting station, and that does also help to some extent. It will change the pH in that environment where you place the seed and the fertilizer, but it won't move very far laterally, and it will move to some extent downwards in the soil. So those are the two things I'd like to talk to you about in this episode today. The first thing is, you need a fertile soil if you want to be productive. And the only way really to evaluate the fertility of your soil is to do a soil sample. And then once you've done the soil sample, one of the first things you're going to look at is the soil pH. Because you want your pH in a maize field to be about 5.2 to 5.5. And so there's some principles that I discussed about how you would evaluate that and how you would rectify a pH that is acidic. So thank you for watching this episode. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to contact us. My name is John McRobert, and I am working for Mukushi Seeds, and our telephone number is 0782 808080. Thank you for watching, and see you next episode.